Welcome to the Injury Report, where we recap the injuries racked up by your favorite horror villains. Villains in horror movies are notorious for their ability to withstand a great deal of damage. Things that would easily incapacitate or even kill a regular person can be easily shrugged off if you're wearing a mask and carrying a sharp weapon. Perhaps no killer embodies this phenomenon like Jason Voorhees from the Friday the 13th films. I'm Griff Robodanger, and in this video, I'm going to look at all the various injuries, accidents, and wounds that Jason suffers and ask, could a normal person survive this? For this first video in the Injury Report series, I'm going to focus on Friday the 13th parts 2, 3, and 4, because those were the films that really introduced the idea of Jason Voorhees as this unstoppable killer, and I wanted to see exactly how unstoppable he was in these films. I also picked these 3 films for this video because, first, the films all take place in the same week, so any serious injuries Jason suffers in part 2 should still be affecting him in part 4. And second, these are the 3 films in what I consider Jason's human years, before he's brought back as a walking corpse in part 6. So let's begin with Friday the 13th part 2. In Jason's first film as a killer, Jason is knocked over with a car door and falls onto his back. Then he's kicked in the balls. He falls on his face trying to tackle Ginny. Jason falls when a chair he's standing on breaks while he's trying to ambush Ginny. Most of these injuries temporarily stagger Jason, but don't seem to do any serious damage. Things get more serious when Jason's forearm is cut with a chainsaw. It doesn't look like an especially deep cut, you almost can't see it in the actual scene, but you can tell later in the film that he did in fact get a pretty nasty gash here that would require stitches. A wooden chair is smashed over Jason's back. Man, Jason just can't catch a break with these chairs. Or rather, he catches too many breaks with these chairs. This chair shot actually knocks Jason out for long enough so Ginny can momentarily escape. Ginny buries a machete deep into Jason's shoulder. So this is the injury that pretty much puts Jason out of action in part 2, depending on whether or not you think the window crashing scene is a dream sequence or an actual event. The machete is embedded pretty deep in Jason's shoulder, I'd say at least 6 inches. I'm no doctor, but I'd assume this went all the way through his collarbone, and I feel like even with medical attention, your left arm would be pretty useless for a long time after an injury like this. But somehow, this injury doesn't seem to have any long-term effect on Jason, as a few days later in the events of Friday the 13th Part 3, Jason is able to lift full-grown men over his head to stash them up on beams, and throw dead bodies through windows. Since we're talking about Friday the 13th Part 3, what damage has Jason taken in that film? Chris tips a bookshelf over, dumping a bunch of hardcover books onto Jason's head. This does manage to knock Jason down, but Jason manages to protect his head here with the axe in his hand, and while I'm sure it doesn't feel good to have a bunch of books dropped onto your head, I don't see it doing any serious damage. Jason's left hand is stabbed with a kitchen knife. I'm no doctor, but it seems like this stab narrowly misses the tendons in Jason's hand. Speaking of stabbing, Jason is stabbed in the knee with the same knife. So Jason gets stabbed in the knee, and it initially seems to affect him as he limps for a while after getting stabbed, but even later in the same movie, he's just sprinting again. Chris lightly punches Jason's arms as he grabs her. Yeah, these punches really aren't doing anything. Chris clobbers Jason over the head with a large piece of firewood, causing Jason to fall through a wooden rail. The firewood over the head is potentially a concussion, and Jason takes a pretty nasty fall afterward, but he doesn't stay down for long. Chris drops onto Jason from above. Honestly, she barely grazes him. If anything, Jason gets a moment of Chris's butt in his face, which, I mean, Chris bonks Jason over the head with a shovel. Surprisingly, this actually seems to knock Jason out for about a minute. Long enough for Chris to hang Jason from a noose from the barn's hayloft. Okay, seriously, this should have snapped his neck and killed him. For most people, this would be instant death. Somehow, Jason not only survives, but he's able to easily release himself from the noose and taunt Chris in the process. Jason is whacked in the forehead with an axe. So this is the attack that takes Jason out for the remainder of the film, but is it survivable? Jason is wearing that hockey mask that takes the brunt of the impact here. The axe is wedged into his head, probably piercing his skull, but maybe not deep enough to reach the brain. And even if it did reach the brain, it's still possible he could survive this. The medics on the scene in Friday the 13th, the final chapter, disagree because Jason is pronounced dead on the scene. He's not dead, however, not yet at least, because he revives at the hospital morgue and travels back to Crystal Lake to get the following injuries. Jason's arm is sliced by a machete when he grabs Trish's leg from underneath the stairs. A few shallow slices to the wrist that convince Jason to let Trish go. Jason takes several hammer shots to the head before getting the claw end of the hammer driven into his shoulder. That's a lot of concentrated head trauma, but it's not enough to make Jason release his grip on Tommy. The claw hammer shot to his neck, however, is enough to get Jason to let go and retreat for like 15 seconds. That wound seems pretty deep. I'd think the thickness of that claw is going to leave a pretty nasty hole in his shoulder meat. Tommy's computer monitor is smashed over Jason's skull. So if you were around when these CRT monitors were a thing, you know that these things were solid. The screen is a very thick, heavy glass. If a monitor like this was smashed over someone's head with enough force to shatter that glass, you're probably talking about fatal head trauma. On top of this, there's electricity running through the monitor when Trish smashes it over Jason's head, so add in the additional danger of electrocution. This attack seems to momentarily incapacitate Jason, but in reality, if someone smashed one of these monitors over your head with enough force to break glass that's at least half an inch thick, your head is gonna be demolished. And even if you did somehow survive, the electricity would probably finish you off. Jason's hand is split in half with a machete. Even Jason seems surprised by this injury, like, what the hell am I gonna do now? For the rest of the movie, he doesn't really use this hand. When he attacks Trish immediately afterward, he grabs her with his right hand, and when he has her pinned to the ground, his left hand just seems to be flailing a bit, as if he can't quite use it. Jason gets chopped in the chest with the machete. A slash to the pectoral muscle should inhibit Jason's ability to attack with his left arm. Of course, so should the Part 2 shoulder attack that happened just a few days earlier. Conveniently, that's also the side with the sliced up hand, so he probably wasn't going to use that arm anyway. Jason takes a machete deep into the skull, then falls and slides down the blade. This death scene was originally meant to end the franchise by being so brutal that Jason couldn't come back from it. And to be fair, this is the end of Jason Voorhees as a mortal being. Tommy hacks away at Jason's prone body with the machete. Just to be safe, Tommy hacks away at Jason until the movie dissolves into a new scene. We don't know exactly where Jason was hit with the machete, and we don't know how many times Tommy hit him, but if Jason wasn't dead already, he's definitely dead now. Until Jason lives, but we'll talk about that in another video. Before I do the final rundown, I want to mention all the risky things Jason does that should lead to injuries and should not be attempted by anyone. Things like punching a window, jumping through a window, headbutting a car window, grabbing someone through a window, jumping through a window again. Man, Jason sure loves breaking windows. Wrestling as a building collapses onto him, reaching through a glass shower door, Kool-Aid Man through a wooden door. So here's the final rundown of Jason's injuries from his week-long killing spree. Jason is hit with a car door, knocked over, kicked in the groin, he falls on his face, he falls off a chair, he's sliced with a chainsaw, smashed with a chair, macheted in the shoulder, pelted with books, stabbed in the hand, stabbed in the knee, barely punched in the arm, clobbered with firewood, stumbles through a rail, dive-bombed by Chris, bonked with a shovel, hanged, axed in the forehead, slashed in the wrist, beaten with a hammer, impaled with a hammer claw, crushed in the head with a monitor, sliced through the hand, chopped in the chest, impaled in the face with a machete, and hacked with that same machete. And there it is, the damage sustained by Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th, parts 2 through 4. How many of these injuries could you survive? Thanks for watching this first episode of Injury Report. I hope to cover more of Jason's injuries in future videos, as well as other characters like Michael Myers and Leatherface. Be sure to subscribe to make sure you don't miss out on those videos when they come out. For now, here's some other videos you might like, and until next time, later Danger Seekers.